In the summer of 1975, inside a government hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan, patients who were stable one moment stopped breathing the next. Their hearts kept beating. Their lungs simply stopped. No seizure, no cardiac event, no warning on any monitor that medical staff had ever been trained to recognize. By the time the pattern was identified, dozens of patients had been affected. At least 9 had died. What followed was one of the largest hospital-based investigations the Federal Bureau of Investigation had ever conducted, a forensic breakthrough that had never before been attempted, and a federal trial that would last 4 months and end with one of the most disputed verdicts of the decade. This is the case of the Ann Arbor Veterans Administration Hospital poisonings and the 2 intensive care nurses, Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez, who were charged, tried, and ultimately never definitively proven guilty or innocent in a court of law. Before we continue, like this video, leave a comment with your own theory by the end, and subscribe to Cold Sure for more documentary-style breakdowns of real cases. This is Cold Sure. To understand what happened at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital in 1975, it helps to understand the hospital itself. The facility, located on Fuller Road in Ann Arbor, Michigan, served military veterans from across the region. Like many VA hospitals during this period, it operated under significant budget and staffing constraints. The intensive care unit, where the majority of the incidents would eventually occur, was staffed by a small rotating team of nurses responsible for monitoring critically ill patients around the clock. Multiple nurses who worked in the unit during this period later told investigators that staffing levels felt inadequate given the acuity of the patients under their care. The hospital's chief of staff at the time was Dr. S. Martin Lindenauer. He would later co-author a book about the events of that summer, describing it as a period that, in his words, threw the hospital into a state of significant alarm. In July and August of 1975, staff began noticing a troubling rise in the number of patients experiencing sudden respiratory failure. These were not patients with a documented history suggesting this kind of event. They were, in many cases, stable, recovering, and unexpectedly stopped breathing without an identifiable medical cause. The pattern escalated. On August 15, 1975, 3 separate patients experienced respiratory failure within a 20-minute window. For hospital staff, this was the moment the situation shifted from concerning to alarming. 3 unrelated, unexplained respiratory arrests in such a short period, among patients with no shared underlying diagnosis, defied any natural medical explanation hospital staff could identify. The hospital's chief of anesthesiology, Dr. Ann Hill, had already been quietly investigating the rising number of respiratory failures before August 15th. She had identified one consistent factor across the affected patients. Every one of them had been receiving intravenous fluids at the time their breathing stopped. By August 15th, Dr. Hill had developed a working theory. The pattern of symptoms she was observing, sudden, complete respiratory failure, with the heart continuing to beat normally, even as breathing stopped entirely, resembled the known clinical effects of a class of drugs called muscle relaxants. Specifically, she suspected a drug called Pavilon, a synthetic muscle relaxant derived from curare, a paralytic compound historically used by South American hunters on the tips of weapons. When Dr. Hill responded to the first of the 3 respiratory failures that day, she administered a clinical test to check for Pavilon's presence. The test returned positive. She then administered the antidote used to reverse the drug's effects during surgical procedures. The patient recovered. The same sequence repeated with the 2nd and 3rd patients that day: a positive test, the antidote, and recovery. This was the breakthrough that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The respiratory failures were not a mysterious illness. They were the result of an outside substance being introduced into these patients' bodies, a substance that should never have been present without a specific medical order authorizing it. VA hospital staff and administration now convinced that someone inside the hospital was deliberately poisoning patients, contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation that same evening. FBI agents arrived at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital and effectively established a temporary headquarters inside the facility, where they would remain for several weeks. The scale of the investigation that followed was, for its time, extraordinary. Agents ultimately interviewed approximately 750 hospital employees, a process that took weeks and required careful coordination with hospital administration to avoid further disrupting patient care. Less than 24 hours after the FBI was called in, an agent named Delmar Ward found himself standing at the bedside of John McCrary, a 50-year-old heart patient from Coloma, Michigan, who had nearly died from a respiratory failure the previous evening. McCrary would become one of the central figures in the investigation that followed. Investigators began working backward from each documented respiratory failure, attempting to determine which staff members had been present on the ward, and specifically near the affected patient's bedside, in the minutes before each episode. This required painstaking review of staffing schedules, nursing assignment logs, and any available eyewitness accounts from other patients and staff who happened to be present. Working alongside hospital staff, investigators were eventually able to identify a total of 51 suspicious breathing failures during the relevant period. After further review, that number was narrowed to 38 respiratory arrests that the FBI believed represented confirmed or highly probable poisonings. Some patients, investigators determined, had been poisoned on more than one separate occasion. At least 9 of these incidents ultimately resulted in death, though some accounts place the death toll as high as 10 or 11, depending on which respiratory failures are included in the final count. A critical piece of physical evidence supported the theory that this was deliberate poisoning rather than a medical anomaly. Hospital pharmacy and prescription records showed that Pavilon had not been ordered or prescribed for any of the affected patients. There was no legitimate medical reason for the drug to be present in their systems at all. The investigation faced an immediate and significant scientific obstacle. In 1975, there was no established forensic test capable of detecting Pavilon in human tissue after death, particularly following the embalming process used in funeral preparation. Several of the suspected victims had already been buried by the time investigators identified Pavilon as the suspected cause. This made the case, from a forensic standpoint, nearly without precedent. Unlike traditional poisons, which often leave detectable chemical traces in blood or organ tissue for extended periods, Pavilon metabolizes rapidly. Within hours of administration, standard toxicology screening at the time would show nothing unusual. A routine autopsy performed using the technology and procedures available in 1975 would not have revealed Pavilon's presence at all. The FBI laboratory was tasked with solving this problem from the ground up. Working with pharmaceutical researchers and university scientists, FBI forensic chemists developed an entirely new laboratory technique, a specialized chemical assay capable of detecting microscopic traces of Pavilon in liver and kidney tissue, even after the embalming process. This was not an existing test that investigators applied to this case. It was a method created specifically because the case required it. With this new test developed, investigators sought and received authorization to exhume the bodies of several patients believed to have died from Pavilon poisoning. Tissue samples were collected and tested using the newly developed assay. The results confirmed the presence of Pavilon in the tissue of multiple exhumed victims, providing the first objective physical evidence connecting specific deaths to the drug. Investigators also identified a critical clinical detail that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Pavilon, when administered as a concentrated, undiluted dose directly into a patient's intravenous line, a method known as a bolus injection, produces a very specific and rapid physiological effect: complete respiratory failure within approximately 2 to 3 minutes, while the heart continues beating normally. Medical experts confirmed that no known disease process produces this exact combination of symptoms. This finding was significant because it sharply narrowed the window of time investigators needed to examine. If a patient's breathing stopped at a known time, the person responsible for administering the poison would have had to be at that patient's bedside within the 2 to 3 minutes immediately prior, not hours earlier. This timing window became, in the words of investigators who worked the case, the keystone of the entire prosecution. It transformed a vague question, who had access to this patient at some point during their hospital stay, into a much narrower one, who was physically present at this patient's IV line in this specific 2 to 3 minute pavulon itself, was not kept under the kind of restricted security one might expect for a drug capable of causing this level of harm. Investigators determined that vials of the medication were stored in an unlocked refrigerator located in the hospital's intensive care unit, the same unit where the majority of the poisoning incidents occurred. This meant that, in principle, virtually any staff member with access to the unit could have obtained the drug without needing to bypass any significant security measure. Investigators worked to systematically eliminate potential suspects from the pool of 750 employees. Dr. Lindenauer, the hospital's chief of staff, was among the first cleared, as he was confirmed to be in Europe on a sabbatical during the period when the poisonings occurred. Other staff members were ruled out because they were not working during the specific shifts when incidents took place, or because they did not have regular access to the intensive care unit where Pavulon was stored. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly focused on 2 nurses who worked in the intensive care unit, Filipina Narciso, age 30, of Ypsilanti, Michigan, and Leonora Perez, age 31, of Evanston, Illinois. Both were registered nurses who had immigrated from the Philippines. Investigators noted that Narciso had been on duty in the relevant ward during every one of the incidents under investigation, a pattern that distinguished her from other staff members whose shifts did not align as consistently with the poisoning events. 2 surviving patients also provided direct eyewitness identifications connecting the nurses to specific incidents. One patient identified Narciso as the nurse who had injected something into his intravenous line immediately before his breathing suddenly stopped. A second patient similarly identified Perez as having injected his IV line just before he experienced respiratory arrest. Both of these patients, however, died of unrelated causes before the case reached trial, meaning neither could testify in person before the jury, and their identifications were instead introduced into the court record through other means. Additional witnesses described specific sightings that investigators considered significant. A witness named Lula Bowles reported observing Narciso near the bedside of a patient named Mark Hogan immediately before his respiratory arrest on July 29, 1975. Another witness, Richard Gasmeyer, identified Perez adjusting the intravenous line of his brother, Charles Gasmeyer, on that same date. A witness named Bonnie Weston reported seeing Narciso handling patient John McCrary's intravenous tubing shortly before his respiratory arrest on August 15th. A fourth witness, Christine Loesch, reported seeing both nurses near patient William Loesch before his own respiratory episode, including, she said, observing Perez preparing a syringe. Investigators also noted a temporal pattern in the broader data. Respiratory arrests appeared to correlate closely with the nurses' duty hours, with no comparable spike in incidents occurring before or after the period when both were assigned to the relevant shifts. In June of 1976, nearly a year after the poisonings began, a 23-member federal grand jury returned an indictment against both Narciso and Perez. The charges were significant: 5 counts of murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and 10 counts related to the unauthorized injection of Pavulon into patients' intravenous medicine. Both women were arrested and arraigned separately, Narciso in Detroit and Perez in Chicago, given that Perez resided in Illinois at the time. Federal prosecutors, while confirming the substance of the charges publicly, declined to disclose what they believed the motive behind the poisonings might have been. stating only that a motive had been identified internally but would not be discussed publicly before trial. The case immediately drew national and even international attention. Both Narciso and Perez were recent immigrants from the Philippines, and the case quickly became a flashpoint for discussions of race and immigration in the American legal system. Some supporters of the nurses argued publicly that the prosecution's case rested heavily on circumstantial evidence, and that the two women, who by all professional accounts had been dedicated and hard-working nurses, had no clear or established motive for committing such serious crimes. The trial atmosphere was further complicated by remarks attributed to a man who had originally been slated to serve as a lead witness for the prosecution. According to court records from the period, this individual referred to Narciso and Perez using an ethnic slur and asserted, without verified evidence, that there existed a coordinated, nationwide conspiracy among Filipino nurses to harm American veterans. This claim was never substantiated and was not the basis of the formal prosecution, but its presence in the broader public conversation surrounding the case contributed to widespread concern that racial bias was influencing how the nurses were being perceived, both inside and outside the courtroom. The trial of Narciso and Perez became one of the longest federal criminal trials in the United States up to that point, lasting approximately 4 months. Assistant United States Attorney Richard DeLonis, who helped lead the prosecution, would later characterize the government's case as highly circumstantial. No physical evidence, such as a recovered syringe with identifiable fingerprints or a direct confession, definitively placed either nurse in the act of injecting Pavilon into a specific patient's IV line in real time. The prosecution's case instead relied on the cumulative weight of witness testimony, placing the nurses at or near patients' bedsides shortly before respiratory arrests, the staffing schedule correlation showing incidents clustering around their shifts, and the forensic confirmation that Pavilon, a drug never prescribed for any of the victims, was present in exhumed tissue samples. As the trial progressed, the presiding judge, Philip Pratt, ruled on several of the original charges before the case ever reached the jury. The judge directed a judgment of acquittal on the murder count against Perez specifically, along with several of the poisoning counts against both defendants, finding that the evidence presented for those specific charges did not meet the legal threshold required to proceed. This left a narrower set of charges, including one remaining murder count, along with multiple poisoning and the conspiracy charge, for the jury to ultimately decide. When the prosecution rested its case, defense attorneys for both nurses faced a significant strategic decision. According to later accounts from those involved, including the defense attorneys themselves, the case the government had presented was considered strong enough by the defense team that they felt compelled to put their clients on the stand to testify directly, rather than relying solely on arguing that the prosecution had failed to meet its burden of proof. Both Narciso and Perez testified in their own defense. According to court observers and subsequent accounts of the trial, both women appeared notably evasive while being questioned, a characterization that some later observers attributed to the women's unfamiliarity with American courtroom procedure and the additional pressure of testifying in a non-native language, while others viewed it as more directly damaging to their credibility before the jury. One of the most unusual developments at trial came during testimony related to the death of a patient identified in court records as John Eilerman. Narciso was specifically accused of poisoning Eilerman by injecting a muscle relaxant into his intravenous line. A surprise witness, a former VA patient named William Miller, whose own hospital room had been located directly across the hall from Eilerman's, testified that he had observed a mental health patient, dressed in green hospital pajamas, enter Eilerman's room and spend approximately 15 minutes there, during which time this individual was, in Miller's description, touching and manipulating Eilerman's intravenous medication tubing. According to Miller's testimony, Eilerman was found dead only minutes after this individual left the room. Miller further testified that he did not see Narciso on the floor at all that night. This testimony introduced what would become known informally as the man in green theory, the possibility that at least one of the poisoning incidents, and potentially others, may have been carried out by someone other than Narciso or Perez, someone who had access to patient rooms but was never identified, charged, or further investigated as a named suspect. The defense pointed to testimony like this, along with the hospital's broadly acknowledged lax security during this period, as evidence that the true scope of who had access to patients' IV lines extended well beyond the two nurses standing trial. Defense attorney Edward Stein later noted publicly that hospital security during this era was minimal enough that doctors, other nursing staff, maintenance personnel, and even visitors could move through the intensive care unit largely unsupervised, particularly during night shifts when staffing levels were at their lowest. The FBI's official position, both during and after the trial, was that the totality of evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward Narciso and Perez, and that while the Bureau had, in the words of one retired agent who later wrote about the case, looked at everybody among hospital staff during its investigation, no additional named suspect was ever formally identified or charged. Notably, prosecutors were not legally required to prove a specific motive in order to secure a conviction on the charges presented, and throughout the trial, the government did not formally attempt to establish one. However, observers and legal analysts following the case noted that the absence of a clear motive presented a real challenge for the prosecution's credibility before the jury. It is difficult for any panel of jurors to accept that two nurses, described by colleagues as hardworking and professionally dedicated, would engage in a sustained pattern of poisoning patients without any apparent reason. In the years following the trial, several individuals who studied the case closely, including a retired FBI agent who later wrote extensively about the investigation, offered a theory regarding what may have motivated the incidents, while being careful to characterize it explicitly as speculative rather than proven fact. This theory held that Narciso and Perez, like other members of the VA hospital's nursing staff at the time, believed the intensive care unit was dangerously understaffed given the acuity of the patients under their care. Both nurses, according to colleagues who were interviewed during the investigation, had made comments at various points, expressing frustration about staffing shortages at the hospital. Under this theory, the poisonings, rather than being intended as direct attempts at homicide, may have been intended to create medical emergencies that would visibly demonstrate the unit's understaffing to hospital administration, with the expectation that the deteriorating patients would then be successfully resuscitated by responding staff. This theory has never been confirmed through any admission, confession, or definitive piece of evidence from either nurse, and it remains, to this day, an unproven explanation rather than an established fact of the case. After the 4-month trial concluded, the jury began deliberations. Those deliberations lasted 13 days, a length of time that was, at the time, considered a record for a federal criminal case in the region, and which reflected the genuine difficulty the jury appears to have faced in evaluating the largely circumstantial evidence presented. The jury ultimately found both Narciso and Perez not guilty on the remaining murder charge that had been presented to them. However, the jury convicted both women on 3 counts of poisoning and on the single count of conspiracy. The convictions were significant, but they fell well short of the murder charges that had originally been filed in the federal indictment, and well short of what prosecutors had originally sought. The convictions did not stand for long. Later in 1977, defense attorneys for Narciso and Perez filed a motion requesting a new trial, arguing that significant errors during the original proceedings had unfairly prejudiced the jury against their clients. Judge Philip Pratt agreed. In his ruling granting the request for a new trial, Judge Pratt found that federal prosecutors had withheld certain information from the defense during the original trial and had made improper statements in front of the jury during the course of the proceedings. Judge Pratt concluded that these actions had created what he formally described in his ruling as overwhelming prejudice against the two nurses, sufficient to undermine the fairness of the verdict that had been reached. With the original guilty verdict set aside and a retrial now ordered, the case returned to federal prosecutors for a decision on how to proceed. According to individuals familiar with internal discussions at the time, prosecutors were aware that public perception of the case had shifted substantially in the nurse's favor over the course of the lengthy legal process. There was also a practical, tactical concern. Having already testified once in a proceeding that did not go well for them, Narciso and Perez would have been unlikely to take the stand again in a second trial, which would have significantly limited the prosecution's ability to present the case in the same way. Ultimately, federal prosecutors made the decision not to pursue a retrial. The charges against both Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez were formally dropped. Neither woman was ever retried, and neither was ever convicted of any charge connected to the Ann Arbor VA Hospital poisonings on a final, standing basis. It's worth pausing here to address directly what the historical and legal record does, and does not, establish, because this case is frequently summarized in ways that overstate the certainty of its outcome in either direction. It is not accurate to say that Narciso and Perez were definitively proven to be the individuals responsible for the poisonings at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital. The murder charges against them did not result in a standing conviction. The poisoning and conspiracy convictions that the jury did return were formally set aside by the trial judge due to findings of prosecutorial misconduct, and those charges were never retried to a final verdict. At the same time, it is also not accurate to characterize the nurses as having been formally exonerated or declared innocent by any court. As one retired FBI agent who studied the case extensively later wrote, "The fact that the guilty verdict was set aside on procedural grounds related to how the trial was conducted does not mean the underlying jury verdict reflected factual innocence. The case, in the most precise legal sense, remains unresolved. No one has ever been convicted, on a final basis, for the deaths at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital in 1975. To date, the case remains officially classified as unsolved. This case is sometimes discussed primarily in terms of legal procedure and forensic innovation, but it's worth remembering the human scale of what happened at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital that summer. At least 9 veterans died as a result of confirmed or strongly suspected poisoning. These were men who had served in the United States military and were receiving care at a federal hospital specifically established to treat veterans. Patients like John McCrary and John Eilerman were not abstract case file entries. They were patients whose families brought them to a hospital expecting medical care, and who instead became victims in what remains, to this day, one of the largest unsolved hospital poisoning cases in American history. For the broader population of patients and families connected to the Ann Arbor VA Hospital during this period, the case also represented a significant and lasting breach of institutional trust. More than 50 separate respiratory failure incidents were identified over a 6-week span inside a hospital where patients and their families had every reason to believe they were safe. For Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez, the case carried an entirely different but equally significant, lasting impact. Both women endured arrest, a lengthy and highly publicized federal trial, conviction, and the setting aside of that conviction, all while living under intense public scrutiny that was, by multiple contemporary and later accounts, substantially shaped by their status as recent immigrants from the Philippines. The case became, in the words of one retired FBI agent who later wrote about it, a cause célèbre, not only in Ann Arbor and across the United States, but in the Philippines as well, where many viewed the prosecution as having been driven by anti-immigrant bias rather than the strength of the evidence alone. Regardless of how the underlying criminal case was ultimately resolved, the Ann Arbor VA Hospital investigation produced lasting, measurable contributions to both forensic science and hospital safety protocol. The forensic assay developed specifically for this case, the laboratory technique created to detect pavilon in human tissue, even after embalming, represented a genuine scientific advancement. Prior to this investigation, no defensible courtroom-ready method existed for identifying this category of drug in deceased patients. The methodology developed by FBI forensic chemists during this case contributed to the broader field of toxicology and influenced how investigators in later cases would approach the detection of fast-metabolizing pharmaceutical agents in suspected poisoning deaths. The case also had a direct and lasting impact on hospital medication security practices. The fact that Pavilon, a drug capable of causing rapid and complete respiratory failure, had been stored in an unlocked refrigerator accessible to a wide range of hospital personnel, was widely cited in the years following the case as an example of inadequate medication control. In the decades since, hospitals across the United States have implemented significantly more restrictive protocols for storing and tracking high-risk medications, including locked, access-controlled dispensing systems and detailed administration logs designed to create a clear, time-stamped record of who accessed a given medication and when. More than 5 decades after the summer of 1975, the Ann Arbor VA Hospital case remains one of the most significant unresolved questions in the history of American hospital crime. 9 confirmed deaths, possibly more. A forensic technique built from nothing because no method to solve this kind of case had ever existed before. A 4-month trial, 13 days of jury deliberation, a conviction reached, and then formally undone. Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez were never convicted on a final, standing basis of any crime connected to these events. They were also never declared innocent by any court. They lived the remainder of their lives, carrying the weight of a case that the legal system itself was never able to fully resolve. Whoever was responsible for what happened inside that intensive care unit during the summer of 1975, whether it was the 2 nurses originally charged, the unidentified patient described in courtroom testimony as the man in green, or someone never identified by investigators at all, has never faced a final conviction in a court of law. The case remains, officially, unsolved. If you want a deeper breakdown of the forensic science behind detecting Pavilon, or a full episode on the immigration and civil rights controversy that surrounded this trial, let me know in the comments below. If you found this case valuable, like this video, subscribe to Cold Sure, and share your own theory on what you believe happened at the Ann Arbor VA Hospital that summer. Thank you for watching.